Hello, I want to talk real quick about mechanical design and how I go through my thought process when designing a new puppet to do something that is a little bit outside of what I normally do. In this case, I'm going to be looking at a puppet that has wiggly eyebrows. So I wanted to make a couple of observations about the decisions I made while designing this puppet. The first thing is this is a very large head compared to many of the puppets that I make. This is a much more average sized head. So under normal circumstances, I don't have that much room to work inside a head this size. If I wanted to make a moving jaw or something like that. Now I could open up the head and carve out a way to make a moving jaw, and I have on previous puppets, but there's a little bit of a limit to how useful that is, because the puppet may have a really great moving jaw, but if you get them 20, 30 feet away from an audience, then the puppet really, you can't really tell that the jaw is moving. The thing is also, I'm constantly being told after a show that people could have sworn that the puppet's jaws were moving, that their mouths were moving. And that's because people suspend a lot of disbelief while watching a puppet show. They sort of see what they want to see. And a puppet can be really very realistic to them, even though there's very little going on in terms of the performance. It's just the voice acting and the lighting and everything else convinces people, oh, that puppet is definitely talking. And then they misremember by the end of it that the character isn't. So usually it's not a big deal. However, here I'm making a fairly famous character, and I decided, you know what? I might as well take advantage of the size of this head. It's really compared to the things that I normally do, this is a huge head. So I decided to hollow it out, and I decided to put some mechanics inside. Now, I've got a few options for what I can do, but I want to make a lot of this. I want to make molds of it, and I want to sort of mass produce it. And so the first thing is I don't want any of the mechanical aspects of it to be a tremendous amount of work. I want them to be there, but I can't do something that, should I, sell this puppet to other fans? I don't want to do anything that will take me forever and a day to construct each time and will end up making the thing cost, some amount of money that nobody's willing to pay. So there's a few things that are sort of out. The first thing is a moving jaw doesn't work on this character. And here you'll see a bunch of pictures that kind of illustrate why. Those are great expressions, but how do you do them on a hard puppet? The answer is not very easily, or maybe not at all. There's probably ways to do it, but not in an acceptable amount of work. The next possibility is I could have the eyes look in different directions. I could, draw pupils on here and have rotating orbs, and that's definitely something that I could have done. It's still a little bit more work than I really want to do per puppet. The other thing is this character doesn't have perfectly round eyes. These eyes are actually kind of strangely squared. They're almost like rounded cuboids. So making moving eyes wasn't super easy to do, and it wasn't really worth it for the effect. So then the next thing that I looked at was eyelids. He could have eye blinks. Eye blinks are pretty cool. You'll notice though that even Muppets don't always have eye blinks, and it's because eye blinks are they're kind of neat in a really sort of well-produced puppet, but they're not really necessary. They're very much sort of icing on top. So I thought, well, the one thing that this character has is this, straight eyebrow that goes across, a unibrow that goes from temple to temple. And I thought, this is where most of his character comes from that isn't something that's impossible to animate in the real world. So I started thinking about, okay, he's going to have a unibrow. What is that unibrow made of? And the first thing is, well, maybe it's a piece of rubber hose or something. Okay, that adds a little bit of work because now I need to color it and maybe add fuzz to it or something to make it eyebrow-like. And maybe I have to figure out how to attach that rubber hose to some kind of manipulator. So I began thinking about what are the types of manipulators, and it struck me that a $4 package of T-pins gives me a heck of a lot of options. So these end up being, somewhere around 4 cents a piece. So that's worthwhile, less than a dime for a pair of manipulators. Now, they don't work perfectly this way. I have to do some alteration to them. One of the things that I realize almost immediately is that they will need to have some type of bend in them. So I do have to individually change the shape of each one. This is something that I can probably repeat relatively easy. The other thing that I had to do was bend the head of the pin sideways. So now that it sort of is a surface that I can glue an eyebrow to. In this case, I decided I'm going to use fuzzy chenille yarn that is already the correct color for this guy's eyebrow. So then the next thing is, well, if it's got this bend in it, on one side it's either got a bungee or a weight, and on the other side is a string going up to the control. So this has to be able to be installed in here, and I have to be able to get it in. That means that the first thing I need to do is make sure that the inside of the wall is thin enough so that I can accommodate all those bends. So that's the first design hurdle, is I've got an eyebrow that can rotate up and down, and if it's connected across with this piece of chenille yarn, it should operate both of them. So now I come to my second design challenge, once I get this in, and that is these two come to some kind of point. And there has to be something that attaches them, or there has to be something that holds them in place. More than that, this can't just fall back out. Like, it needs to be held on this end. I don't want to spend any effort soldering something on here. It might not even be that effective. That's one of the reasons I decided to use a bend in the steel. Had I just used the straight pin and then glued or soldered something on there, that could fail. That could break at some point long after, this has gone into the hands of some collector or whatever. So what I want to do instead is design everything to make it impossible for it to fail at a later date, or at least very unlikely. So that's a big part of the design challenge. Eventually, I came up with this very strange looking piece. So what I did is I started with just the piece that goes across, that has the holes in it. And I knew that it was going to have to fit into the sides of the head. So then I decided to make little specific marks, because I'll make a mold of this. I want those always to be the same. And then there's a couple holes. You can see that I used some super glue and toothpicks to repair holes that didn't work for me. The first part was that. Then I realized I needed something to attach a bungee cord to. And originally I had this plate on the bottom that had a couple holes. Then I sort of felt like it needed some reinforcing. And then I needed something to keep the pins from falling back out of the head. So I ended up, through a long iterative process, creating this little bulkhead. Now what happens is you can see that the end of the pin sits neatly in a little hole for it. Now, the only thing that I have to do, and this allows the pin to rotate, but never leave this post that kind of holds it in place. And I can do the same thing with this other one. I can get it in place. And now I've got two eyebrows that can move independently and can have bungee cords or weights attached to the bottom end to pull them down, and strings going up to the marionette control to pull them up. So then my next challenge is relatively simple. To secure these, once I've installed these in the final product, I can just have a little strip of plastic that I glue across the top there that essentially captures those. So now these are unable to fall out of the head, and they've got their prescribed motion and everything else once I've already completed the mechanism. So I believe this will be a relatively reliable mechanism for years and years to come without any maintenance. But even if you need to do maintenance, basically what I'll do is once I build the hair onto this character, it will attach perfectly at these points, and I'll just use a tiny little bit of super glue in each of those 3 points. And if somebody really needs to repair something, they can get an X-Acto knife in there or something, and they can cut those 3 connections, and they can get into the head, and they can repair it, and they can super glue it back together, whatever they want to do. So anyway, there's my character, or not my character. This is, everybody has probably figured out, this is Rick from Rick and Morty. But here are 2 independently moving eyebrows that will be able to give me a fairly wide range of expressions, even on this relatively expressionless face. Thanks very much for watching.